Tonight we journey back nearly 1,000 years to candlelit rooms, restless scholars, and questions sharp enough to unsettle empires. Al-Ghazali, one of the most brilliant minds of the Islamic world, rose to the height of fame only to discover that certainty can be a fragile mask. At the very peak of his career, his voice broke, his appetite vanished, and his confidence shattered. And instead of ignoring the storm, he did something far more dangerous. He followed it. Imagine a man who could silence philosophers with flawless logic, who stood at the center of power and prestige, suddenly walking away in disguise to seek answers in silence. Damascus, Jerusalem, Medina, all became stops on his search, not for wealth, not for applause, but for something every restless heart craves: peace. Along the way, he reframed doubt not as a curse, but as a doorway. He rebuilt faith not as blind tradition, but as luminous certainty. And he defined the quiet soul not as withdrawal from life, but as living with clarity, humility, and mercy in the middle of it. This is not just philosophy buried in dusty books. It is practical, piercing, and oddly familiar. Al-Ghazali speaks to every one of us who has wrestled with anxiety, distraction, and the endless noise of the world. He shows how intention can turn ordinary acts into worship, how habits can polish the heart, and how faith can be more than arguments. It can be light. So before you think this is just about a scholar from the 11th century, consider this. What if doubt itself was the very thing that could make your faith stronger, your mind calmer, and your life a little more clear? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we uncover the story of Al-Ghazali and how doubt, faith, and the quiet soul can still guide us in a world drowning in noise. The town of Tus lay under a sky of soft blue, its streets alive with the sounds of markets and prayer, yet within its quieter corners a story was beginning that would ripple across centuries. In a modest home, where walls held the warmth of family and the silence of reflection, a child sat by the glow of a simple lamp. His eyes, wide and searching, seemed to drink in more than letters and lessons. They absorbed mystery itself. His name was Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, and though few around him could know it, he was destined to wrestle with questions so dangerous and so powerful that they would unsettle kings, scholars, and believers alike. But before the world knew his name, there was only Tus, a city where shadows of curiosity first took shape. Ghazali was born in the year 1005 of the Common Era, when Persia was part of a vast and shifting empire. His father, a man devoted not to wealth but to knowledge, believed that learning was more precious than gold. When he died, he left his sons in the care of a Sufi friend, entrusting them to the guardianship of wisdom rather than the security of coin. It was here that young Ghazali began to feel the pull of two worlds, the earthly need for survival and the deeper hunger for meaning. These early days were filled with both tenderness and uncertainty, shaping a boy who would one day see doubt not as weakness, but as the beginning of understanding. The alleys of Tus were lined with teachers who trained young minds in grammar, logic, and law. Ghazali moved quickly among them, his mind sharper than most, his memory almost frightening in its clarity. He copied texts with care, listened with patience, and spoke rarely, yet his silence was not emptiness, but depth. In his heart, questions grew. Why do we trust what others tell us? Can we be certain of the things our eyes see and our hands touch? Even as a boy, he felt the tug of mysteries larger than himself, mysteries that whispered in the stillness of the night. It is said that children carry in them the seeds of their future, and in Ghazali, those seeds glowed like embers. He would sit long after lessons ended, staring at a candle as its flame trembled against the dark. Did it burn by its own power, or by something unseen? He could not name the question yet, but the candle seemed to challenge him, daring him to look deeper. To others, it was just a flame. To him, it was a symbol, a riddle, a call. The town around him, carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Merchants bargained in the bazaar, women drew water from wells, and soldiers marched under banners of distant rulers. But in one household, under the care of teachers and the watchful eye of God, a mind was awakening. That mind belonged to a boy who would grow to doubt the world and, through doubt, find faith again. The candle in Tus was no longer just light against darkness. It was the beginning of a journey, one that would carry a quiet child into the heart of the greatest debates on faith, reason, and the soul itself. The road from Tus to Baghdad was not simply a journey of miles, but a passage through ambition, promise, and hidden doubt. The young Ghazali, carrying with him the lessons of childhood and the discipline of early study, entered the bustling heart of the Islamic world. Baghdad, in the 11th century, was unlike any other city. It was a crossroads of cultures, a place where ideas clashed and mingled as easily as the goods traded in its markets. Its libraries overflowed with manuscripts, its mosques echoed with debates, and its streets pulsed with the voices of merchants, scholars, and seekers. To walk into Baghdad was to step into the very center of knowledge and power, and Ghazali's name quickly began to rise among its most gifted minds. He arrived at the Nizamiya, the most prestigious college of the age, founded to be a fortress of learning and religious authority. Here he dazzled both students and teachers with a brilliance that seemed almost effortless. His memory was flawless, his reasoning sharp, and his ability to silence opponents in debate earned him admiration and fear in equal measure. The halls of the Nizamiya soon echoed with his voice, and students crowded to hear his lectures. In a city that valued eloquence and mastery of logic, Ghazali seemed to embody the perfect scholar. Yet beneath this growing fame, something in him stirred uneasily, a restlessness that no applause could calm. For all his success, Ghazali began to notice how fragile prestige could be. Praise filled the air during the day, but at night, when the city quieted and the lights dimmed, a different voice whispered inside him. Was he teaching for truth or for reputation? Were his words meant to bring hearts closer to God, or to secure his place in the hierarchy of scholars? The clamour of Baghdad lifted him high, but it also weighed on him, pressing doubt against his chest like an unseen hand. The boy who once stared at a candle in Tus now found himself staring into his own motives, uncertain of what lay at the core. The grandeur of Baghdad could not be ignored. Minarets pierced the sky, palaces stretched across the horizon, and markets brimmed with the scents of spice and ink. But Ghazali sensed the city's brilliance came with shadows. Scholars competed fiercely, not always for wisdom but for favour and authority. The Nizamiya, while a place of learning, was also a stage of politics, where knowledge was often bent to serve power. Ghazali's rise placed him at the centre of this stage, admired yet scrutinised, celebrated yet burdened. In the silence after debates, he wondered if victory in argument brought him closer to truth or only deeper into pride. And so the road to Baghdad was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of an inner conflict. He had reached the heights of recognition, yet the applause that surrounded him felt hollow, like echoes in a vast chamber. His mind could silence rivals, but it could not silence the doubt growing louder within him. Prestige was his companion by day, but unrest followed him into the night. The road to Baghdad had carried him to greatness, but it also carried him into the heart of his own uncertainty, a place where ambition and faith would soon collide. The great lecture halls of Baghdad were filled with the hum of expectation. Students pressed together, their eyes fixed on the man at the lectern, the one whose reputation had spread across the empire. Al-Ghazali stood tall, his voice steady, his arguments precise, his logic cutting through objections like a blade through silk. To the outside world, this was the height of mastery. His fame was unmatched, his authority unquestioned, and his words carried the weight of certainty. Yet behind the polished brilliance, a quiet storm gathered, invisible to those who praised him. For even as he spoke with conviction, inside him a shadow grew, a voice that whispered questions he could not ignore. Day after day, he delivered lectures that left his audience in awe. He explained law with clarity, defended theology with rigor, and silenced those who dared to challenge him. But one morning, as he began to speak, something unexpected happened. His voice faltered. His tongue, once quick and sharp, hesitated, as if words had suddenly lost their footing. The students noticed only a pause, brief and strange, but to Ghazali it was a crack in the foundation he had built his life upon. He felt a tremor within, the kind that no argument or applause could silence. Public certainty clashed with private doubt, and for the first time, the weight of his position seemed unbearable. Each evening, when the crowds dispersed and the halls grew silent, Ghazali sat alone with his thoughts. The applause of the day faded quickly, leaving behind only the echo of his own unease. Was he teaching truth or merely playing a role? Were his arguments for God's sake or for the admiration of men? The glittering lectern that had raised him so high now felt like a cage, each word he spoke locking him tighter within the expectations of others. His body still carried him forward, but his heart hesitated at every step. The city of Baghdad admired his brilliance, but no one saw the struggle behind his eyes. He found himself questioning the very tools he had mastered. Logic could win debates, but could it heal a restless heart? Rhetoric could silence rivals, but could it silence doubt? In the darkness of his chamber, Ghazali admitted what he could not confess aloud. Certainty had slipped from his grasp. The knowledge he wielded so powerfully in public no longer offered him peace in private, and so the glittering lectern, once a symbol of triumph, became a mirror reflecting his hidden turmoil. Each lecture was a performance, flawless on the surface, yet trembling beneath. The cracks had begun to show, not to the world, but to himself. He had reached the summit of fame, yet the view was clouded by uncertainty. The man who seemed to hold all answers now stood face to face with the most dangerous question of all. What if he did not know? The lectern glittered still, but to Ghazali it gleamed with unease, marking the beginning of a crisis that would soon consume him. The morning began as any other in Baghdad, with students gathering in the grand halls of the Nizamiya, eager to hear the master speak. The air was heavy with expectation, the kind that comes when every word is believed to carry the power of truth. Al-Ghazali stood before them, the man who had never failed to command attention, whose lectures had lit the minds of countless scholars. But as he opened his mouth, the words that once flowed with ease seemed to vanish. His tongue felt dry, his throat constricted, and what came out was a broken silence. The students leaned in, waiting, but nothing came. The man who had once filled these halls with brilliance now stood mute. His speech turned to ash before it left his lips. What had once been joy and mastery became terror. Ghazali left the lectern trembling, his body betraying him. Appetite fled from him, food lost its taste, and each attempt at conversation ended in strain. The confidence that had carried him through debate after debate was gone, replaced by a suffocating heaviness. It was as though the very ground beneath his life had cracked open. Doctors called it illness of the body, but Ghazali knew it was deeper. This was not a sickness of flesh, but of spirit, a wound that no medicine could heal. Alone in his chambers, he faced what he had long feared. For years he had spoken with certainty, yet inside he had wrestled with questions that refused to be silenced. Now those questions demanded to be heard. Stripping him of the mask he had worn, he could no longer pretend. Doubt had risen like a tide, and instead of drowning it with arguments, he was forced to let it wash over him. It terrified him, but it also whispered something new. Doubt was not an enemy to destroy, it was a summons to honesty. The silence that once shamed him became a mirror. He began to see that the applause of Baghdad, the prestige of his lectures, even the sharpness of his logic, had all been fragile shelters. They crumbled in the face of this crisis, leaving him with nothing but himself and God. Every attempt to cling to reputation burned away. He tasted the hollowness of ambition, and the ash on his tongue was a reminder that words without sincerity are empty. This was not the end of his story, but the breaking point that would reshape it. The man who had risen on the power of speech would now learn through silence. The scholar who had sought certainty in debate would now search for it in the depths of the soul. As days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, Ghazali began to accept that the loss of speech was not punishment, but mercy. It stripped him of illusion and forced him toward truth. The words that turned to ash cleared the path for a different voice, one not born of pride or ambition, but of sincerity and faith. In the stillness of this crisis, a new journey had begun. The silence that once weighed heavily on Ghazali slowly began to take a new shape. Where others saw collapse, he began to see the beginning of deliverance. Doubt, which had stolen his voice and left him trembling in the halls of Baghdad, revealed itself not as a curse, but as a tool. If the old certainties had turned to dust, then perhaps only what could endure questioning was worthy of trust. It was a terrifying thought, but also a liberating one. Instead of crushing doubt under the weight of habit, Ghazali decided to test everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, until only the truest foundations remained. He began with the senses, those trusted guides of daily life. Sight, touch, taste, hearing, smell. Could they be fully relied upon? He remembered dreams so vivid they felt real, only to wake and discover them false. If dreams could trick the senses so easily, what assurance was there that waking life was not another deception? The realization unsettled him. If the senses could not be trusted entirely, then certainty must be found elsewhere. Reason seemed to stand higher, a more solid foundation. Through reason, he had triumphed in debate and dazzled the halls of the Nizamiya. Yet even reason showed cracks. He saw that arguments often depended on assumptions that could be questioned, and conclusions shifted depending on the angle of thought. Philosophers claimed reason could reach all truths, but Ghazali began to doubt whether reason could travel beyond the limits of the human mind. Could logic explain the unseen, the eternal, the divine? Or did it merely circle within its own boundaries, never touching what lay beyond? Inherited belief was next to be tested. From childhood, faith had been taught as truth. Teachers spoke with confidence, parents repeated lessons, communities reinforced traditions. But if a boy were born in another land, taught other beliefs, would he not accept them with equal conviction? Ghazali realized that inherited belief was powerful, but not absolute. It shaped people, but it could not prove itself beyond question. Tradition provided comfort, but comfort was not certainty. Each layer he tested seemed to fall away, like wood burning in a fire, leaving behind only ashes. Yet something remarkable happened. The fire of doubt did not destroy him, it purified. What survived the burning was not empty despair, but a clearer sense of where true knowledge might be found. The senses were useful but limited. Reason was brilliant but bounded. Tradition was meaningful but vulnerable. None could stand alone as an unshakable foundation. For the first time, Ghazali understood doubt as deliverance. It stripped away illusions and forced him to seek what could endure beyond the reach of skepticism. The pain of losing certainty became the doorway to a deeper search, a path that would carry him away from the glittering lectures of Baghdad into the hidden chambers of the soul. In doubt, he discovered not an end, but a beginning, the first spark of a journey that would define his life. When Ghazali looked out at the world of ideas, it seemed like a desert road where 4 distinct paths stretched into the horizon, each one claiming to lead to certainty. The dust of debate hung heavy in the air, stirred by the voices of scholars, mystics, and philosophers. Each group promised to guide the soul beyond confusion, yet each path carried dangers of its own. For a man searching desperately for truth, the choice was not simple. It was a test of both the mind and the heart. The first path was that of the theologians, the defenders of doctrine. Known as the scholars of Kalam, they built their fortresses with arguments, shielding faith from attacks of skeptics and philosophers. They spoke with precision, using logic to guard revelation, and their debates were sharp enough to cut through doubt. Ghazali admired their courage, but he also saw their limits. Kalam could protect the mind from error, yet it rarely nourished the soul. It was a shield in battle, but when the fighting ended, it left the heart hungry. The second path was that of the philosophers, the Falasifa, who inherited the legacy of Greece and Persia. They claimed that reason was the torch capable of lighting all mysteries. They spoke of Aristotle and Plato, of metaphysics and causality, and their confidence dazzled audiences. To them, the world was a puzzle that could be solved through logic alone. Ghazali studied their works deeply, entering their system until he knew it from within. Yet he began to see that their brilliance sometimes outran their grasp. They made claims about eternity and the divine that their proofs could not fully sustain. Their system was vast, but cracks ran through its foundations. The third path was more hidden, the way of the esotericists, the Batiniya. They whispered of secret knowledge, guarded by chosen leaders. Their promise was alluring, for they claimed to carry answers that others could never reach. To follow them was to surrender doubt in exchange for the certainty of obedience. But Ghazali grew wary. He saw how easily such hidden authority could be misused, how mystery could become a cloak for control. Certainty gained by blind submission was not the kind of truth his restless heart sought. The fourth path was that of the Sufis, the seekers who turned inward rather than outward. Their claim was that true knowledge was not merely thought, but tasted. They spoke of purifying the heart, of remembering God with every breath, of finding a presence that transformed doubt into clarity. Their language was not of proofs, but of experience. Ghazali found in them a different kind of promise, one that spoke to the quiet ache in his soul. Yet even this path was demanding, requiring discipline, sincerity, and the courage to strip away pride. Standing in the dust of these four roads, Ghazali realized there was no easy way forward. The theologians, the philosophers, the esotericists, and the Sufis each offered a piece of the puzzle. To find the whole, he would need to test them all, to walk each path until its truth or emptiness revealed itself. The search for certainty was no longer an idea. It had become a journey through the very heart of human possibility. The halls of Baghdad were alive with debate, and at their center stood the theologians of Kalam. They were warriors of words, defenders of doctrine who wielded logic like a sword. Their mission was clear. They sought to protect the faith from the doubts of skeptics and the challenges of philosophers. They built careful arguments, layer upon layer, showing that belief in God and revelation could stand firm against attacks. Ghazali admired their discipline. He saw how Kalam could shield believers from confusion, how it could expose the flaws in opponents' reasoning, how it could steady the mind in the face of questions that might otherwise overwhelm. It was a powerful tool, but even as he mastered it, he began to see its limits. Kalam could argue for God's existence with precision, but it could not make the heart feel the presence of God. It could show that revelation was logical, but it could not make a man weep with love or tremble in awe. Ghazali realized that while dialectical theology could guard the gates of belief, it could not nourish the soul inside those walls. Logic kept enemies out, but it could not fill the emptiness within. The heart needed more than proofs. It needed light. As he listened to the debates around him, Ghazali saw a strange pattern. Victories in argument brought pride to the debaters, but rarely brought peace to their listeners. Words piled upon words, objections answered with counter-objections, yet something essential was missing. Faith defended was not always faith deepened. The people who most needed assurance often left unmoved, their minds impressed but their hearts untouched. Kalam succeeded in protecting religion's honor, but it failed to address the quiet hunger of the soul. For Ghazali, this realization was unsettling. He had mastered the art of Kalam. He could silence opponents and win admiration. But late at night, when the debates were over, his doubts remained. The sharpest syllogism could not answer the ache within him. He began to see that certainty was not the same as life. Proof was not the same as presence. The mind could be convinced, yet the soul could still wander in restlessness. This discovery marked a turning point. He did not abandon Kalam, for he respected its value. It was necessary to defend the faith from attack, but he no longer believed it could deliver the certainty he sought. Kalam could secure the walls of belief, but it could not open the door to intimacy with God. That door, he realized, required something beyond argument. It required an encounter, an unveiling, a transformation of the heart. And so Ghazali began to turn his gaze elsewhere. He still admired the defenders of doctrine, but he now saw their limits clearly. Logic had carried him far, but not far enough. The hunger within him remained, whispering that the soul seeks more than guarded truths. It seeks a flame that reason alone cannot ignite. The world of philosophy opened before Ghazali like a glittering palace, its halls filled with reason, its walls built on logic, and its windows looking out on the mysteries of existence. The philosophers, heirs to the Greeks, spoke with confidence about the soul, the heavens, and the nature of God. They claimed their reasoning could explain everything, from the movements of the stars to the order of creation itself. To many, their system seemed unshakable, a fortress of certainty. Ghazali did not turn away from them. Instead, he stepped inside, determined to learn their craft from within, to see whether their claims could truly bear the weight of truth. He immersed himself in their works, studying Aristotle, Plato, and their Muslim interpreters who had carried Greek thought into the heart of Islamic learning. He admired their sharpness of mind, their disciplined reasoning, and their ability to build arguments that dazzled like jewels. They taught that everything in the universe followed a chain of causes, that knowledge could be reached through demonstration, and that reason alone was the supreme path to understanding. For a time, Ghazali allowed himself to be their student, polishing his mind against theirs until his mastery of their methods rivaled even the most accomplished philosophers. But as he reflected, cracks began to appear in the mirror of philosophy. Their arguments shone brilliantly, but not all of them held. When they spoke of mathematics, logic, and natural science, their reasoning was powerful and often true. Ghazali respected these strengths and never denied their value. Yet when they turned their reasoning toward God, the soul, and the unseen, they ventured into realms where their proofs grew thin. They claimed eternity for the world, denying creation in time. They reduced God's knowledge to universal truths, denying his knowledge of particular events. They denied the resurrection of bodies, claiming only the survival of souls. These claims, Ghazali saw, were not built on demonstration, but on assumption. The palace of philosophy glittered, but some of its walls were fragile, more illusion than stone. The more he examined, the clearer the fault lines became. The philosophers had stretched reason beyond its natural limits, applying it to questions it was never meant to solve. Their logic was brilliant in its place, but when used to probe the mysteries of faith, it faltered. Ghazali saw that their conclusions about God and the hereafter were not only flawed but dangerous, leading minds astray under the guise of certainty. His respect for their method did not blind him to their errors. Instead, it prepared him to confront them with precision. Through this journey, Ghazali emerged both sharpened and sobered. He took from the philosophers their strengths, using logic as a tool and respecting science where it was true. Yet he also recognized the danger of letting reason reign unchecked, as though it alone could uncover every mystery. In the mirror of the philosophers, he saw brilliance and beauty, but also distortion. It was this vision that would lead him to write one of his most famous works, exposing the fault lines that others were too dazzled to see. The silence of Ghazali's crisis gave birth to a book that would shake the world of philosophy. After years of mastering the arguments of the Falasifa, he took up his pen and began to write a work that would cut into their claims with precision. He titled it Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and in its pages he turned their own weapons of logic against them. This was no careless attack. It was a surgical critique, carefully aimed at the points where their system appeared strongest, but in truth was weakest. Ghazali admired reason, but he refused to let it become a tyrant that claimed more than it could prove. His book exposed the fault lines hidden beneath their glittering arguments. One of the pillars he struck was the idea of necessity, the belief that the universe followed a chain of causes so fixed and unbreakable that nothing could occur otherwise. The philosophers insisted that everything in creation flowed inevitably from the nature of God, leaving no room for choice, freedom, or miracle. Ghazali challenged this. He argued that necessity belonged to God alone, not to the world. To bind the Creator with the chains of cause and effect was to strip him of power. The philosophers had turned God into a distant principle rather than a living Lord who could act at will. For Ghazali, this was not only false reasoning, but dangerous to faith. Causality itself became another target. The philosophers claimed that fire burns cotton by its own nature, that the cause and effect are bound together. Ghazali refused to accept this. He declared that fire does not burn by itself, but only by the will of God, who creates the act of burning whenever he chooses. If God wished, fire could touch cotton without harm, or the sea could part before a prophet. By reducing causality to a habit of the world, the philosophers had closed the door to miracles and narrowed the scope of divine power. Ghazali shattered this chain, insisting that every event is an act of God renewed at each moment. The philosophers also claimed demonstrative certainty about matters of the unseen, speaking as though their reason could measure the eternal. They denied creation in time, claiming the world had always existed. They reduced God's knowledge to abstract universals, denying his knowledge of every particular detail. They denied bodily resurrection, reducing the afterlife to a shadow of the soul. For Ghazali, these claims were not the fruits of demonstration, but the overreach of pride. Reason could not reach into eternity. To pretend otherwise was incoherence disguised as brilliance. The impact of his work spread like an echo across the world of learning. Some hailed him as the defender of faith, who struck down arrogance with clarity. Others accused him of destroying philosophy itself, leaving nothing but ashes where once there had been a palace of thought. But Ghazali's purpose was not to burn down knowledge. It was to place it in its rightful place, strong within its limits, but humble before the mysteries of God. The incoherence of the philosophers was not the end of his journey, but its echo would sound for centuries, reshaping the way scholars thought about reason, faith, and the delicate line between them. In the heart of his search, Ghazali's path led him to the threshold of a different kind of promise. Beyond the philosophers and theologians stood a hidden school, the Batiniya, whose whispers moved through courts, markets, and mosques alike. They spoke of secrets too deep for ordinary minds, truths guarded by an inner circle, and knowledge revealed only to those willing to surrender completely. Their appeal was powerful. For those weary of endless debate, the offer of certainty without struggle was like water in a desert. All one had to do was trust the hidden authority, the living guide who claimed to hold the key to all mysteries. To many, it was irresistible. The Batiniya framed their message with brilliance. They argued that reason had limits, that the world was filled with confusion, and that the only way through the fog was to lean on a chosen leader who alone knew the truth. Their system was neat, their words persuasive, and their authority absolute. In a world shaken by doubt and power struggles, their promise of stability carried weight. Ghazali understood why so many were drawn to them, for their path seemed to solve the anxieties that haunted both scholars and common people. Yet he also saw the peril hidden within their offer, for to follow them required more than respect. It demanded the surrender of reason itself, to ask no questions, to accept without examination, to obey without reflection. This was the price of entry, and to Ghazali it was too high. Truth, he believed, could not rest on blind submission. If faith was stripped of inquiry, then it was no longer strong but fragile, built on dependence rather than conviction. The hidden school offered the comfort of certainty, but it was a certainty that silenced the mind and chained the conscience. Ghazali tested their claims, weighing their logic against his own search for sincerity. He found that their secrets were often cloaked in vague language, more shadow than substance. Their reliance on authority turned into a tool for power, binding followers not to truth but to leaders. What appeared to be hidden wisdom was often little more than control dressed in mystery. The more he looked, the more he saw that this path, while alluring, led not to liberation but to captivity. Yet he did not dismiss them with scorn. He recognized the deep hunger that drove people into their arms. In a world full of confusion, people longed for certainty. In a time of unrest, they longed for stability. The Batiniya promised both, and that promise was seductive. But Ghazali resolved that the only true path must honor both reason and faith, both inquiry and devotion. Anything less was a betrayal of the human soul. The call of the hidden school lingered in his memory as a warning. It reminded him that the search for truth could never be taken lightly, for false certainty was often more dangerous than open doubt. The Batiniya had shown him how easily the mind could be subdued by the allure of secrets, but they also strengthened his resolve. Ghazali left their whispers behind, determined to seek a light that would not extinguish reason but refine it, a certainty that could stand without chains. The noise of debates, the weight of prestige, and the hollow certainty of arguments had left Ghazali weary. He had stood among theologians, philosophers, and the secretive Batiniya, and each time he found brilliance mixed with fragility. None had quieted the storm within him. It was then that his gaze turned to the Sufis, a path that spoke not of endless proof, but of presence, not of victory in argument, but of transformation in the heart. Sufism did not offer escape from the world, but discipline within it, a way of shaping the soul until it became a vessel for light. For a man who had spent years in the glitter of Baghdad's lecture halls, the quiet call of the mystics was unlike anything else. The Sufis spoke of dark, the taste of truth. It was not enough, they said, to argue about honey. One must taste it to know its sweetness. In the same way, it was not enough to prove God's existence with words. One must feel his presence until it became more real than breath. This idea pierced Ghazali like an arrow. He realized that while his mind had collected knowledge, his soul had starved for certainty that could not be shaken. Reason had carried him far, but reason alone could not heal the restlessness of the heart. What drew him was not mysticism, as people often imagined it, a vague dream or escape from responsibility. What drew him was the rigorous discipline of the path. The Sufis trained themselves through prayer at dawn, silence when others argued, fasting that stripped away distraction, and remembrance of God that filled every pause. It was a school of the soul, demanding honesty and humility at every step. Ghazali saw that this was not an easy refuge. It was harder than debate, sharper than philosophy, more exacting than theology. But it was also the only path that promised to bring the heart into harmony with faith. He watched as Sufis lived quietly, yet radiated a peace that no argument could steal. Their devotion was not measured in applause, but in sincerity. They did not seek to conquer rivals, but to conquer the self. Their knowledge was not written only in books, but inscribed in their lives. Ghazali saw that, here, knowledge became more than information. It became transformation. It became presence. The turning toward the heart was not sudden. It was the slow realization that all other paths had left him unsatisfied. Logic defended the gates. Philosophy dazzled the mind. Secret schools promised shortcuts, but only Sufism touched the core of human longing. Ghazali understood that to walk this road meant giving up his pride, his reputation, and perhaps even the security of his position. But the promise was too profound to ignore. For the first time, He saw a way of living that might quiet the storm within. Knowledge must become taste, proofs must become presence, and the restless heart must finally find its home in the remembrance of God. The day came when Ghazali could no longer carry the mask of certainty. His tongue had faltered in the lecture halls, his heart had grown heavy with doubt, and the applause of Baghdad had begun to sound like an echo in an empty chamber. With a decision that shocked his students and startled the city, he chose to leave it all behind. He did not announce it with fanfare. Instead, he slipped away in disguise, as if fleeing both the world and the version of himself that prestige had created. It was not exile forced upon him by others. It was exile by intention, a turning of his back on power and applause to search for what books could never give. His path first carried him to Damascus, where he hid among the narrow streets and towering minarets. There he found quiet in the great mosque, climbing its minaret to sit alone and reflect. The city was full of life, merchants calling in the markets and scholars debating in courtyards, yet he chose silence. In that silence, he practiced the remembrance of God until his breath itself became a prayer. For months he lived in seclusion, letting the noise of the world fade so the stirrings of the heart could be heard more clearly. It was here that he began to taste the peace he had long sought. From Damascus he journeyed to Jerusalem, a city layered with history and holy longing. Among its sacred stones, he felt the weight of prophets who had walked before him. He prayed in the Aqsa Mosque, letting the rhythm of devotion anchor his restless mind. The city, contested and scarred by centuries of conflict, became for him a reminder that faith was not only theory but survival, not only argument but endurance. Each day of prayer carved a deeper humility into him, teaching him that truth was not conquered in debates but encountered in presence. His longing then pulled him further, to the prophet's city of Medina. To stand near the resting place of Muhammad was to feel the closeness of the message he had spent his life studying. Ghazali did not come as a famous teacher here, but as a seeker among seekers. In the hush of the prophet's mosque, his doubts softened, not erased but reframed. He began to see them not as enemies but as shadows that pushed him toward light. He realized that the certainty he sought was not a fortress of arguments, but a quiet trust born of devotion. This exile by intention lasted years, marked not by dramatic events, but by the steady reshaping of the soul. Baghdad, with its applause, felt like a distant memory. The world he had left behind was one of titles and triumphs, but the world he entered was one of silence, remembrance, and hidden strength. What he learned in Damascus, Jerusalem, and Medina could never be captured in the lines of a book alone. It was written instead in the slow, unseen transformation of his heart, a transformation that would one day carry him back into the world with a new voice, tempered by humility and lit with sincerity. In his years of seclusion, Ghazali began to see that the soul could be trained much like the body. Just as muscles are shaped by repeated effort, the inner life was sculpted by habits that turned attention toward God. The Sufis called it the science of the path, not because it was measured with numbers or weighed with instruments, but because its results were as real and repeatable as any experiment. Ghazali realized that if he wanted peace of heart, he would need more than arguments. He would need practices that carved new grooves into his being, slowly replacing distraction with remembrance. One of the central practices was dhikr, the remembrance of God. In the silence of Damascus and Jerusalem, he repeated the divine names until they became like breath itself. At first the mind wandered, pulling him into worries of the past and hopes of the future. But with each repetition, the heart grew steadier. Dhikr was not about magical words, but about attention. It taught him that where attention goes, the soul follows. To remember God was to draw the heart back from its restless wanderings and anchor it in presence. Alongside remembrance came hunger, the deliberate practice of fasting beyond the obligations of Ramadan. For Ghazali, hunger was not punishment, but purification. He discovered that when the body was full, the heart grew heavy, dulled by comfort. When the body was restrained, the heart sharpened, rising in alertness. Hunger stripped away illusions of self-sufficiency and taught him dependence. It was a reminder that the human being is fragile, a creature of need, and that true strength lies not in endless indulgence, but in learning to master desire. Night vigils became another pillar of his training. While the city slept, Ghazali rose in the darkness to stand in prayer. The silence of the night gave weight to every whispered verse, every bow, every tear. These hours demanded sacrifice, for the body longed for rest, yet the soul awakened in ways daylight rarely allowed. Ghazali saw that the discipline of rising against sleep was not about hardship for its own sake, but about breaking the chains of laziness. It was an act of claiming freedom, a way of telling his soul that worship was more urgent than comfort. Through these rituals he discovered a profound truth. Habits shape attention, and attention shapes the will. A man who fills his days with distraction will find his will weakened, his soul pulled in every direction. But a man who shapes his days with remembrance, restraint, and devotion will find his will becoming like steel, firm yet flexible, able to carry him through storms without breaking. Ghazali had once believed that knowledge alone could guide him, but now he saw that knowledge without practice was a lantern without oil. The science of the path was the art of filling that lantern daily so its flame could burn steady. Step by step, hunger, dhikr, and night prayer reshaped him. They taught him that freedom of the soul was not given but cultivated, and that the will was not born strong but trained through patient effort. In the quiet discipline of these practices, Ghazali found the beginning of the peace he had been searching for, not as theory, but as lived reality. There were nights when Ghazali felt that his years of searching had been like wandering through a dense fog. Books had given him words, debates had given him weapons, but neither had given him the light he longed for. Then, in the quiet of his seclusion, something shifted. It did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with a stillness so deep that it seemed to open a window inside him. He began to sense that the heart, long clouded with pride and vanity, could become like a polished mirror. When cleansed of its stains, it reflected truth not as theory, but as luminous presence. The Sufis spoke of this as unveiling, when the veils that cover the soul are slowly lifted and the light of God is glimpsed. Ghazali realized that the doubts which once tormented him had not been signs of failure but part of the polishing. Every crack in his old certainty, every collapse of pride, every tear of confusion had scraped away a layer of dust. What remained was not a hollow emptiness, but a surface ready to reflect. When he prayed now, when he remembered God in the still hours of night, his heart felt illuminated from within. This was not the brittle certainty of arguments. It was a living light that could not be shaken by clever words or hostile crowds. Ghazali found himself recalling the verse of the Quran that spoke of light upon light, a parable of divine guidance that seemed to describe his own transformation. He understood now that faith was not merely agreeing with doctrines or defending positions. Faith was a clarity that dawned in the heart, a certainty that shone not because it was forced, but because it was revealed. At times, he felt the contrast vividly. The halls of Baghdad had demanded sharp answers, applause, and intellectual dominance. But here, in solitude, a single tear shed in prayer felt more convincing than 100 victorious debates. He saw that pride had been his greatest veil. As long as he sought to be admired for his knowledge, his heart could not reflect the truth. Only when vanity fell away did the mirror clear, and in that clearing came a light brighter than any candle. Yet he did not mistake this unveiling as a final arrival. He knew the mirror of the heart could always gather dust again. Certainty was not a possession to be stored, but a flame to be tended. The practices of remembrance, fasting, and prayer were not ends in themselves, but tools to keep the surface clear, to protect the heart from being darkened once more by ego and distraction. In this new clarity, faith reappeared not as a burden, but as joy. It was no longer a list of obligations to be defended, but a living relationship with the one who gave life itself. Ghazali realized that the journey had not erased doubt, but transformed it. Doubt had broken his false certainties so that true certainty could be born. This luminous certainty was not fragile, for it rested not on his effort alone, but on the light of God, reflected in a heart finally ready to receive it. For so many years, Ghazali had lived with a storm inside him. Doubt had gnawed at his confidence, pride had twisted his pursuit of truth, and fear had stalked him even in moments of triumph. Yet, through exile, discipline, and unveiling, the storm began to quiet. What emerged was a state the Quran calls sakina, a tranquil poise that descends when the heart is at rest with God. It was not the silence of exhaustion or surrender, but a calm strength, like a river that flows steadily after years of flooding. Ghazali began to see that this quiet soul was not a dream for saints alone, but a state that every human heart could taste when it turned away from vanity and toward presence. The signs of this quiet soul were subtle but unmistakable. First was clarity without arrogance. Ghazali had once believed that clarity meant winning arguments, outshining rivals, or dazzling audiences with proofs. Now he understood that true clarity was a gift of light, not a weapon of pride. When the heart is quiet, truth appears simply, without the need for force or show. One no longer feels the urge to crush opponents with cleverness, but instead to share what has been seen with gentleness. Clarity without arrogance was a mark of the soul at peace. Another sign was devotion without harshness. Too often, devotion is twisted into rigidity, as if zeal must be proven by severity. Ghazali had seen men who prayed long hours yet scorned those around them, who fasted with discipline but turned their discipline into judgment. The quiet soul is different. Its devotion is steady but soft, firm in commitment yet free of cruelty. It bows in prayer with humility, not as performance, and its fasting makes the heart tender, not bitter. For Ghazali, devotion without harshness was a measure of sincerity. The fragrance of faith lived with balance. The quiet soul also showed itself in patience with others. In Baghdad, he had lived in a world of debates where interruption, insult, and rivalry were constant. But when the storm within him settled, he found patience rising naturally. He no longer needed to rush to prove himself or to guard his pride. He could listen, he could wait, he could forgive. Patience became not a forced act, but a reflection of inner steadiness. This state of sakina did not mean that all doubts vanished forever, or that struggles ceased. Rather, it meant that struggles no longer ruled him. The heart had found an anchor, a center of gravity that held firm even when storms raged outside. For Ghazali, this was the meaning of the quiet soul. It was not a fragile peace that could be broken by a question or a criticism. It was a resilient peace, born of surrender to God and refined by discipline. In the end, Ghazali realized that the journey was not about escaping turbulence, but about learning how to carry calm within it. The quiet soul was not detached from the world, but engaged with it differently. Clarity without arrogance, devotion without harshness, patience without pride. These became the marks of a life that had moved from turmoil to tranquility, from noise to sakina. When Ghazali finally returned to public life, it was not the same man who had once stood on the glittering lecterns of Baghdad. The applause that had once fueled him now sounded hollow, and the sharpness of debate that had once defined his prestige no longer stirred his heart. His exile had carved away pride and replaced it with humility. His years of seclusion had stripped him of the hunger for victory and replaced it with a longing to heal. To many it looked as though he had returned, but in truth he had not. The man who sought triumph was gone, and in his place stood a man who saw authority not as spectacle, but as stewardship. The halls he walked into were still filled with students, eager for his words. They remembered the Ghazali, who could unravel a philosopher's argument with precision, who could silence opponents with dazzling clarity. Yet when he spoke now, his voice carried a different weight. He no longer sought to dazzle but to reach the heart. Instead of tearing down rivals, he spoke of sincerity, of intention, of the need to unite knowledge with practice. His lessons shifted from battles of intellect to guidance for the soul. The lectern had once been a stage for dominance, but now it became a place of service. Students noticed the change. Some were unsettled, hoping for the old brilliance that crushed doubts with logic alone. Others were drawn more deeply, sensing that his words, though gentler, carried greater power. He spoke less often, but when he did, his teaching carried the quiet authority of one who had wrestled with himself and emerged transformed. For Ghazali, this was the meaning of returning without returning. His body stood again in the world of scholars and courts, but his heart remained anchored in the silence of Damascus, Jerusalem, and Medina. He also began to view authority differently. Where once he might have seen it as a mark of triumph, he now saw it as a heavy responsibility. To be given influence was to be entrusted with souls, not to be decorated with fame. He taught as one who would be accountable for every word, careful that his speech healed rather than harmed. The years of seclusion had taught him that a single sincere word could reach further than 100 clever ones. He guarded his speech as a shepherd guards his flock, careful not to lose even one. Yet this change did not mean withdrawal from the world's needs. On the contrary, it deepened his engagement. He wrote and taught about how society could flourish when guided by sincerity and balance. He urged rulers, scholars, and ordinary believers alike to cultivate their hearts as carefully as they cultivated their lands and homes. Authority, he insisted, was never a crown but a trust that demanded humility. Ghazali's return revealed that the true journey had not been from Baghdad to exile and back again. The true journey was inward. By returning without returning, he showed that the soul can stand in the same place, yet live entirely differently. He had left behind the man of arguments and applause, and become a man of presence and stewardship, a guide who no longer sought victory but healing. When Ghazali took up his pen to write the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, he was not trying to build something new from the outside. He was rebuilding from within. He had seen how religion could become hollow when reduced to argument and ritual without soul. He had seen scholars defend doctrine with sharp logic, but neglect the quiet work of intention. In his great book, he sought to restore the inner architecture of faith, showing that religion is not a shell of rules but a living house built on sincerity, accountability, and the careful shaping of the heart. At the foundation of this inner architecture stood intention. Ghazali insisted that every act, whether prayer, charity, or even simple daily habits, only carried weight if guided by the right purpose. A deed done for show, for pride, or for applause was like a wall built on sand. But an act done with pure intention became solid, enduring, a stone in the structure of the soul. For him, the secret of faith was not the action alone, but the why behind it. He urged his readers to examine their motives constantly, to clear away the vanity that crept in unnoticed. Above this foundation, he raised the pillar of sincerity. Sincerity was not a word to be repeated, but a discipline to be lived. Ghazali described it as cleansing the heart of hidden agendas, stripping away the need for recognition, and living as though one's actions were seen only by God. Without sincerity, he warned, the most impressive ritual was empty. With sincerity, even the smallest gesture carried weight. He spoke of sincerity not as a lofty idea, but as a daily struggle, a polishing of the heart that had to be renewed again and again. Another vital part of this architecture was accountability. Ghazali taught that every soul must act as its own witness and judge, measuring each day as a merchant counts his accounts. He urged people to sit with themselves in the quiet of night, reviewing words and deeds, seeking forgiveness where they had erred, and giving thanks where they had done well. Accountability was not about despair, but about clarity. It allowed the soul to grow without illusion, to see both its strength and weakness honestly. To complete this structure, he explored the anatomy of vice and virtue. Ghazali mapped the diseases of the heart with the precision of a physician, naming greed, envy, anger, and pride as illnesses that corrode the soul. He described their roots and offered cures drawn from discipline, prayer, and reflection. But he also celebrated the virtues that could replace them: humility, generosity, patience, and gratitude. Virtue, he wrote, was not natural to the human being, but cultivated like a garden, watered daily with intention and care. Through the Ihya, Ghazali gave the world a vision of religion as inner architecture. He showed that rituals and laws are not abandoned, but filled with meaning when built on sincerity, intention, and virtue. For him, the revival of faith did not mean louder arguments or stricter rules. It meant restoring the heart to its place as the true sanctuary, a space where devotion was rebuilt stone by stone until it became a house of light. Ghazali often spoke of intention as if it were a hidden fire that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. A simple act like eating, walking, or even sleeping could become worship if guided by the right niyya, the inward resolve of the heart. He called this the alchemy of intention, a power that turned base metals into gold. For him, the true measure of a deed was never its size or outward form, but the secret flame that moved it. A loaf of bread shared with the hungry could weigh more in the scales of eternity than 1,000 words spoken for applause. He explained that intention works in two directions. When aligned with God, it lifts the soul. When mixed with vanity, pride, or hidden agendas, it corrodes even the most impressive deeds. A man could give charity in public, and the crowd might cheer his generosity. Yet, if his heart sought fame, the act was hollow. Another man could whisper a prayer in the dark, unseen, and unheard, and that prayer would shine brighter than palaces because it rose from sincerity. Ghazali saw that what corrodes worship is not weakness, but the subtle poison of false motives. The heart must be watched carefully, for its disguises are endless. Practical counsel became a central part of his teaching. He urged his students to pause before every action, no matter how small, and ask why they were doing it. If they prayed, was it to fulfill obligation or to be noticed? If they studied, was it to understand truth or to boast of knowledge? Even rest could become worship if taken with the intention of renewing strength to serve God better. The secret, he said, was to make the heart conscious before the act began. Once intention was set, the act itself unfolded as worship. He also warned that intention must be renewed often, for motives shift like shadows. A deed that begins pure can be stolen midway by pride. A scholar might write to help others, but soon feel the hunger for praise. A teacher might speak for guidance, but find delight in applause. Ghazali urged vigilance, like a merchant checking his accounts, correcting the heart whenever it strayed. Renewal of intention was itself an act of devotion, a way of admitting weakness and returning again to sincerity. The alchemy of intention revealed to him that worship was not confined to mosques or rituals. Every moment of life could be sacred if approached with the right resolve. To eat with gratitude, to work with honesty, to speak with kindness, to raise children with patience. All of these became forms of worship when the heart sought God through them. The world itself became a classroom, where every act was an experiment in aligning will with the real. Through this teaching, Ghazali showed that the path to God was not hidden in grand gestures alone, but woven into the fabric of daily life. By purifying intention, the simplest moments turned radiant. The alchemy of intention was the secret that allowed the soul to walk in light even in the most ordinary tasks, transforming existence itself into a form of worship. Ghazali had wrestled with the claims of the philosophers who insisted that the world was bound in chains of necessity, that fire burned cotton because it was in the very nature of fire to burn. He refused to accept this. For him, the world was not a machine left to run on its own, but a stage where every act was created fresh by God in each moment. Fire does not burn by itself. God creates burning. Water does not quench thirst by its own power. God creates refreshment. This vision, later called occasionalism, placed causality not in the objects themselves, but in the will of the Creator, who sustains all things. By reorienting causality in this way, Ghazali did not deny the patterns of the world. He admitted that we see regularity, that when fire touches cotton, it nearly always burns, that when a seed is planted, it usually grows. But he insisted that this regularity is a habit established by God, not an independent law. If he willed otherwise, the fire could touch cotton without harm, as when Abraham was thrown into the flames and emerged unharmed. If he willed otherwise, the sea could part, bread could multiply, or the dead could rise. What we call natural laws are in truth divine habits, steady only because the Creator sustains them. This vision had profound effects on how Ghazali understood trust. If the world is nothing more than chains of necessity, then God seems distant, locked into rules he cannot alter. But if every act is created fresh, then every breath, every step, every spark of fire is a reminder of God's nearness. Trust, or tawakkul, becomes natural, for the believer knows that nothing happens apart from the will of the one who is closer than the jugular vein. To rely on God is not superstition but the most rational posture, since He alone is the true cause of all things. At the same time, Ghazali warned against confusing trust with negligence. To say that God creates burning does not mean one should plunge into fire recklessly. To say that God provides does not mean refusing to work for food. Prudence and effort are part of the divine order. The farmer plants his seeds, the traveller carries provisions, the physician prescribes medicine, but in every case the heart remembers that success rests not in the tools but in God's will. Effort is the vessel, but provision is the gift. Through this teaching, Ghazali gave believers a way to live between despair and arrogance. They need not despair when causes fail, for God's power is beyond them. They need not grow arrogant when causes succeed, for it is God who made them work. The doctrine of occasionalism was not a cold philosophy, but a way of deepening reliance. It turned the regularities of the world into reminders of divine nearness, and it freed the heart from worshipping the chain of causes. Fire does not burn by itself. God creates burning, and in that truth, the soul learns both humility and trust, walking with effort, yet leaning always on the will of the real. Ghazali knew from bitter experience how easily the heart can be corroded by power and prestige. He had tasted the applause of Baghdad, the admiration of students, the respect of rulers, and he had nearly lost his soul to it. He called this corrosion the rust of the heart, a film that builds slowly, almost invisibly, until the mirror of the soul no longer reflects truth. In his writings, he turned this personal struggle into a wider critique of his age, warning both scholars and rulers of the subtle poison that influence carries. For scholars, the danger was pride disguised as piety. Ghazali had seen how the pursuit of knowledge could become a ladder not to God but to status. The lecture hall could turn into a theatre where brilliance was performed for applause rather than for sincerity. He described how scholars, seeking favour from rulers or admiration from crowds, would bend their words to please rather than to heal. The heart that once thirsted for truth grew dulled by the sweetness of praise, until teaching became a career rather than a calling. For Ghazali, this was one of the greatest tragedies, for those entrusted with guiding others could themselves become lost. Rulers, too, were not spared his criticism. He warned that authority carries with it a temptation even greater than wealth. A ruler may begin with the desire to protect and provide, but the taste of power quickly hardens into the hunger for control. Surrounded by flattery, shielded from honest voices, leaders could mistake their will for wisdom and their orders for justice. Ghazali urged rulers to remember that their power was only a trust, and that every decision would be weighed not by courtiers, but by God. The throne was not a crown of triumph, but a seat of accountability. Yet he also understood that neither scholars nor rulers lived in a perfect world. Systems were flawed, institutions were messy, and influence was sometimes unavoidable. The challenge was not to escape the world entirely, but to live lucidly within it. He taught that clarity comes from constant examination of intention. A scholar must ask whether his words are meant to guide or to impress. A ruler must ask whether his decision protects the people or simply strengthens his own position. By keeping the heart under watch, one could remain within imperfect systems without being consumed by them. The politics of piety, as Ghazali described it, was not about withdrawing from society, but about resisting corruption of the soul. It meant accepting responsibility without surrendering sincerity, serving without being enslaved by ambition. He warned that influence is like a sharp blade. It can carve paths of justice, but it can also wound deeply if held carelessly. The only way to carry it safely was to polish the heart constantly with remembrance, humility, and accountability. In the end, Ghazali's critique was not meant to condemn, but to awaken. He had lived through the rust of the heart himself, and he knew how easily power and prestige could blur vision. His call was simple yet demanding: to live lucidly, to guard sincerity in the midst of applause, and to remember always that the true measure of influence is not fame or authority, but the state of the heart before God. Ghazali never believed that the path to God was reserved only for scholars, mystics, or rulers. He knew that most people were merchants, parents, artisans, farmers, and laborers who spent their days in the rhythm of ordinary tasks. For them, the search for truth could not mean endless debate or seclusion in monasteries. It had to be woven into daily life, into the way one spoke, worked, and treated others. In his writings, he gave guidance for this, showing that the soul could find God not only in lofty philosophy, but in the ordinary acts of dailiness. For the merchant, honesty was the heart of devotion. Ghazali had seen how easily trade could be poisoned by greed, lies, and exploitation. He taught that every coin exchanged was a test of sincerity, every bargain a chance to practice justice. To cheat in weight or price was not just bad business, but a wound to the soul. Yet, to trade with honesty, to keep one's word, and to seek fair profit was to turn the marketplace into a place of worship. Commerce itself could become an act of remembrance when guided by fairness and gratitude. For parents, he emphasized mercy and patience. The home, he said, was a training ground for the soul, where children learned not only manners, but the shape of faith through the behavior of their elders. A harsh parent could scar a child's heart, while a gentle one could plant seeds of compassion that lasted a lifetime. Ghazali taught that to raise children was not simply to feed and clothe them, but to model kindness, to teach responsibility, and to show them how to pray with sincerity. In every bedtime story, every word of correction, every gesture of care, parents shaped not only bodies but spirits. For artisans and workers, he urged diligence and sincerity. Whether one carved wood, built homes, or wove cloth, every act done with care became worship. Sloppy work was not just a failure of skill, but of intention. To labor with excellence was to honor God, for the work of human hands reflected the dignity of creation. In the rhythm of hammer and chisel, loom and needle, the heart could practice remembrance, turning craft into devotion. He also spoke of measured speech and timely silence. Words, he reminded, are powerful tools that can heal or wound, clarify or confuse. To speak truthfully, gently, and at the right time was an act of faith. To remain silent when speech would harm was an even greater act. Ghazali saw that the discipline of the tongue was one of the hardest but most necessary practices for anyone seeking sincerity. Above all, he urged mercy as habit. Mercy was not to be kept for grand gestures, but woven into the small fibers of daily life. To greet with warmth, to forgive small mistakes, to share food with neighbors, to care for the poor. All of this was the ordinary believer's path. Ghazali's vision made it clear that sainthood was not far from reach. It was hidden in the honesty of the marketplace, the patience of the home, the diligence of the workshop, and the mercy of daily life, lived with awareness of God. After Ghazali laid down his pen and left his mark on the world, his influence did not end with his own lifetime. It echoed through centuries, inspiring some, disturbing others, and forcing generations of thinkers to wrestle with the questions he had raised. His blend of reason, revelation, and experience became a touchstone in Islamic thought, but also a spark of controversy. Some hailed him as the reviver of faith, the one who saved religion from the dangers of unchecked philosophy. Others accused him of weakening the very spirit of philosophy that had enriched the intellectual world of Islam. Doubt after Ghazali did not disappear. It grew, shaped and reshaped by those who inherited his legacy. For many scholars, Ghazali became a model of how to integrate disciplines. He had mastered kalam, philosophy, and mysticism, and instead of dismissing them outright, he tested them, took their strengths, and exposed their weaknesses. His Ihya Ulum al-Din became a handbook for the inner life, studied across the Muslim world from North Africa to India. Generations of believers found in his words a way to balance outward practice with inner sincerity. His teaching on intention, sincerity, and the purification of the heart turned households, schools, and even marketplaces into spaces of devotion. In this way, his legacy was not just intellectual, but deeply practical. Yet his critique of the philosophers left a more complicated mark. Some praised his Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, as a necessary defense of faith against dangerous speculation. They saw in his arguments a shield that protected Islam from drifting into the uncertainties of Greek metaphysics. Others, however, argued that his attack weakened philosophy in the Islamic world, discouraging bold inquiry and narrowing the horizons of intellectual exploration. Thinkers like Ibn Rushd in Andalusia rose to challenge him, writing The Incoherence of the Incoherence, in response, defending philosophy as essential for understanding God's creation. The debate did not end with them. It echoed for centuries as scholars weighed the balance between reason and revelation. Mystics found in Ghazali a kindred spirit. His turn to Sufism gave legitimacy to a path that had often been dismissed as excessive or marginal. By embracing discipline, remembrance, and unveiling, he showed that mysticism could live alongside scholarship. Sufi orders across centuries drew strength from his example, pointing to him as proof that true knowledge required both intellect and heart. For them, Ghazali was not a man who fled doubt, but a man who turned doubt into a doorway toward God. At the same time, his insistence on the constant examination of intention and the dangers of pride served as a mirror for scholars and rulers in every generation. Some welcomed his warnings, others resisted them, for his critique exposed the vanity that thrives in every age. Doubt after Ghazali was not only philosophical but personal, as students, teachers, and leaders all faced the same question he had wrestled with. Why am I doing this, and for whom? In the centuries that followed, his legacy became both a beacon and a challenge. He had shown that reason must be honored, but also humbled, that revelation must be studied, but also lived, that experience must be disciplined, but also embraced. Later thinkers could not ignore him. Whether they followed his path, challenged his conclusions, or sought to refine his synthesis, they all walked in the shadow of his struggle. Doubt after Ghazali was not an end, but an inheritance, a reminder that faith and uncertainty will always meet, and that the search for truth is never complete. In every age, the human mind struggles with restlessness, but in the modern world, the struggle has become louder and faster. Phones buzz, screens flash, advertisements pull at the edges of attention, and the pace of life leaves little room for silence. Neuroscience studies the brain's wiring, therapy maps the layers of trauma and habit, and entire industries are built on capturing and selling attention. In this landscape, Ghazali's methods echo with surprising relevance. Though he lived in the 11th century, his focus on attention, habit, and intention offers tools for navigating the distraction economies of today. Neuroscience shows that the brain is shaped by repetition. Patterns of thought and behavior carve pathways that become easier to follow over time. Ghazali understood this in his own language when he spoke of the science of the path, where rituals and remembrance train the soul to incline toward God. Modern science confirms what he taught centuries earlier: habit sculpt the self. Just as his fasting sharpened awareness and his night vigils strengthened discipline, today people find that small, consistent practices, whether mindfulness or prayer, rewire the mind toward calm and focus. Ghazali would remind us that the key is not the act alone, but the intention behind it, the inner resolve that turns habit into transformation. Therapy today teaches the importance of honesty with oneself, of naming hidden motives and unconscious desires. Ghazali's insistence on examining intention mirrors this. He warned that deeds corrode when driven by pride or vanity, even if they appear good on the surface. Modern psychology speaks of self-deception and cognitive biases. Ghazali spoke of the nafs, the ego that disguises its hunger in noble clothing. Both recognize the need for vigilance, the careful work of questioning why we act as we do. His advice to pause before each act and renew intention sounds strikingly similar to therapeutic practices of mindful awareness. The economy of distraction thrives by keeping the heart and mind scattered. Social media, endless entertainment, and constant news cycles encourage shallow attention, training the brain to crave novelty rather than depth. Ghazali faced no smartphones, but he faced his own versions of distraction: applause in Baghdad, endless debates, the hunger for prestige. His solution was the cultivation of dhikr, remembrance that drew attention back from scattering into focus on God. For a restless modern mind, this could mean setting boundaries on digital noise, carving moments of silence, and treating attention as the most precious resource. He would likely say that what we give attention to is what we become. Ghazali's legacy shows that the struggle for a quiet soul is timeless, even if its forms change. Where he spoke of polishing the heart to reflect truth, today we might speak of calming the nervous system or rewiring the brain. Where he warned of hidden motives, therapists speak of shadow work and emotional honesty. The language shifts, but the essence remains. To live with focus, sincerity, and peace requires discipline of habit, clarity of intention, and stewardship of attention. In this way, modern mirrors reflect what Ghazali taught long ago, that the path to tranquility is not in escaping the world, but in training the heart to live lucidly within it. In the end, Ghazali's journey came full circle, returning not to the glittering lecterns of Baghdad, but to the quiet town of Tus, where his story began. The boy who once stared into a flickering candle had travelled through storms of doubt, halls of philosophy, the whispers of hidden schools, and the silence of Sufi seclusion. He had written works that shook empires of thought and had walked away from applause that once defined him. Now, in the stillness of his final years, he discovered that the candle of Tus had never gone out. Its flame had followed him all along, waiting for him to see that the light he searched for was not in fame or argument, but in the heart at peace. For Ghazali, doubt was no longer a shadow to be feared, but a doorway that had led him closer to truth. Without doubt, he would have remained content with borrowed certainties, mistaking applause for knowledge. Doubt had broken his pride, stripped him of illusions, and forced him to seek what endured beyond words. It had been painful, at times crushing, but in hindsight, he saw it as mercy. The storm had been the path to calm. The wound had been the entrance to healing. He taught that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the light that dawns after it, a clarity born from wrestling honestly with the questions of the soul. Faith for him was no longer a matter of intellectual victory. It was light, a living presence that filled the heart when vanity was polished away. He described it as luminous certainty, different from the brittle confidence of debate. This faith could not be shaken by clever arguments or shifting fortunes, because it rested not on the self but on the real, who sustains all things. For Ghazali, faith was not assent to ideas, but the quiet recognition of God's nearness, the assurance that every moment is created fresh by his will. In Tus he lived simply, teaching those who sought him, raising his children, and practicing the habits that had carried him through exile and return. The night vigils, the remembrance, the discipline of intention, all continued, not as spectacle, but as quiet anchors. The quiet soul he described in his writings was not an abstract state, but a daily practice. It was patience with family, honesty in dealings, humility in teaching, and mercy in judgment. It was a life where the heart no longer rushed restlessly, but rested in sakina, the tranquility promised in Scripture. When death came, it did not find him unprepared. He had spent years training for that final stillness, letting go of pride, polishing the heart, and learning to trust in God's nearness. The candle that lit his childhood questions became the symbol of his life's end, a small light, steady and sufficient, illuminating the darkness with quiet radiance. Ghazali left behind books, arguments, and legacies that would stir centuries of thought, but more than that, he left an example of a heart that found peace. Doubt had been his doorway, faith his light, and the quiet soul his final home. In Tus, where it all began, he returned not to applause, but to stillness, carrying within him the flame that never went out.